Hello everyone and welcome to today's LinkedIn Live panel. My name is Jean-Guillaume Pommier. I'm the Global Head of Innovation at iProspect, and today I'm delighted to be joined by a fantastic group of experts to talk about a very timely topic, which is what are the new fundamentals of culture marketing in the era of the algorithm. At iProspect, we've just launched our latest thought leadership called Culture Accelerated, and today we thought with this group of experts we'd take the conversation and bring it live. Why is it a timely topic? Well, we're very much in the era of culture marketing. Marketers definitely know that if they connect well through culture, they can really create special bonds with consumers and are more likely to grow. But we live in the era of platforms and algorithm. So essentially, the shape of culture is changing at a faster pace than ever before. We're talking about more fandoms, more scale, more conversions from culture to commerce, but also less trust, more clutter, and more fight for attention. So we definitely believe at iProspect now is the time for a reset. We think culture marketing needs to pivot from a stroke of luck to an engineered success. And at iProspect, we have three magical ingredients that we really believe power this new philosophy. First of all, you need to think of hyper-specialism about platform. How does that give you the signals to figure out where to play in culture? Second of all, we really want to lean on the luxury category because that will give us really best-in-class cultural playbook that we can learn from. And thirdly, we really want to rely on the native culture squads, those people who can guide brands in a way to kind of embrace culture. So at Dentsu, with our entertainment and sports network, we're very much at the forefront of that. And so today I'm delighted to be joined by four brilliant minds who will help me decode what are the new rules of that culture marketing in the algorithmic era. So first up, we have Kathy Boxall, who is Global Head of Entertainment at Dentsu. She's very much at the forefront of how brands can tap into culture and entertainment to create meaningful impact. Next up, we have Edward Campbell, our EVP of Luxury Strategy at Dentsu, who also comes from Highsnobiety. He will have first-hand insight into how luxury brands have been able to stay relevant and use culture effectively. I also want to welcome Christina Karasolis, or KK, who heads the luxury and auto partnership at TikTok in UK. She's really at the front row of all things culture, moving at speed, and how brands really tap into that effectively. And next up, I want to welcome Gabby Khan, who's a creative strategist at Dentsu Sports and Entertainment, and who'll have a first-hand on what are the fandoms that brands really need to engage to really kind of cut through. So this is it. We're ready to go. We have our panel of experts, and let's get started. So first up, I want to come to you, KK and Edward, and to talk a little bit more about this big notion of cultural fluency, which is really important. And I think there's so many things we can learn from luxury brands. So I think both of you have got some really interesting kind of lessons there. Start with you, Edward, maybe.
Definitely. I mean, I think when we talk about the idea of cultural fluency, I always like to say anecdotally, it's about showing your audience that you're really sort of in lockstep with them when it comes to culture, that you're in some ways, watching the same TV shows, following the same influencers. And I think it's not sort of just a nice to have. I think what we're seeing time and time again, and there's been a lot of data about this over the last few years, is that people really resonate with brands that sort of follow the same passion points as they do. So cultural fluency, when we talk about it, particularly in the report, is really about kind of demonstrating that you're able to speak, on the same terms and really sort of like demonstrate the same cultural passion that your audience have. And I think it's really emerging as a critical marketing currency. I'm sure you'd agree.
I completely agree. And I love that you called it a cultural currency, because when we really think about, and I take it from a TikTok perspective, culture moves in real time. And so the brands that are able to actually be culturally fluent are the ones that will cut through. And I think it's been a really unique shift, because ultimately what we've seen is that culture has changed in the past 5 years and the way in which it's actually influenced marketing. We've always talked about luxury brands being at the forefront of cultural relevance. But what I think's been really interesting is that 5 years ago, luxury brands or culture in general was very much dictated from the top down. And what we've seen now is that culture is actually dictated from communities themselves. And so community is now a very central part of the narrative narrative and the storytelling that we have. And so for luxury brands, that was a big change because it was no longer them telling the story. They had to welcome in a two-way conversation. And that two-way conversation, I would say, ultimately was scary at first. And so for them to now have the everyday person be part of that culture is a very unique shift in the way in which they're approaching content creation. And it's become a very big paradigm shift in the way that they create that content too.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I love the way that you point out that requires a lot of kind of boldness and confidence from brand to change that culture. And we talk a lot about relevance. And one of the things I think is really interesting is brands who are able to figure out how they can find those new spaces. So you mentioned communities and kind of different, not top down. I guess I'd love to get a sense from all of you actually a little bit more how brands are able to kind of go against the flow. Maybe data will tell them they need to maybe look at more counterintuitive spaces. That's a big theme that we talked about in our report. How can showing up in surprising new spaces kind of allow them to really kind of do that fluency bit? Kathy?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. Brand entertainment, or the way we talk about entertainment for brands, it's kind of about two things. It's about standout. You talked about the algorithmic era. It's all about kind of differentiation and making sure your brand stories can pop. But it's also about getting people's attention and holding on to it for like a period of time. And I think doing that, sometimes you have to act in a little bit of a counterintuitive way and sort of try and find those kind of strange, unusual spaces to pop up in, because that's where you'll get that impact. So a really good example of that is something we've done recently. We did a partnership with Friendship, the movie, for Subway. The scene was mad. Like it was a scene that was complete. I mean, essentially the character was on drugs. It was very edgy. It was set in a restaurant. It was very funny. It was quite silly. But the Subway clients just absolutely lent into it. And we're like, our audience will get this. It's authentic. It's funny. Like people will get the joke. And they got a whole scene out of it set in a Subway, which you don't normally see in a sort of brand partnership like that. 100% share of voice. Like it was excellent. So things like that, or things like Campari showing up in the White Lotus, which is, it's a show about murder and horrible people, but they were able to be there because they were sitting on a beautiful beach and it was lovely Italy and it was aperitivo. It worked really well for them. So I think sometimes sort of letting go of the control, not feeling like things have to be completely brand safe all the time, and also having a bit of a sense of humor so that you can have those authentic connections with your customers, with your audience, is really important.
Yeah, I love that, especially that notion of authentic connection and just, having less control is a big leap of faith. Anybody want to build on good examples of those counterintuitive spaces?
I actually love what you said about that, about Campari. And I think it's interesting when you say counterintuitive.
Yeah.
I think counterintuitive is an interesting word because, it can show up and feel original and it can feel unique, but actually it's never counterintuitive. It's actually deeply intuitive. That makes so much sense.
True.
And the best brand work, the best brand partnerships is when it makes sense. And you're like, why didn't I think of that? Why has no one thought of that before?
Yeah.
But the way you get to that, it can be an interesting way in. And I think that's a really interesting place for partnerships to explore, looking at data, the nuances in data, how can we as a brand partner with something to do with our values, maybe something to do with the way we see the world. Partnerships can come from anywhere. So I think that's a really nice example because it's a surprising context.
Yeah.
But yeah, when it comes to overall brand authenticity and wanting to sort of join culture, I think that it cannot be bought. Cultural relevance cannot be bought. It is the last sacred thing. And I think that's why people view it with such prestige, particularly at the moment, because it's something you can't buy. So everyone wants it, but it can't be bought. But you can set yourself up for better success in catching on and gaining cultural relevance and traction. But there's no step to buying it, but you can definitely do the right things to help your brand.
I love that. I love that notion of, taking the right steps and just being confident. I just wanted to kind of double down on this notion of algorithm and counterintuitive. A lot of what we do in media is all about attention and cut through. So I just wanted to get your take around maybe the ratio between, turning up differently and the algorithm more likely to kind of break through. And, from a TikTok perspective, what does that mean? And who are the brands who are doing that well, I guess?
It's a really good question. I think the counterintuitive stops the scroll. And we always say when we were reinventing what TikTok was in this space, and particularly for luxury brands, we had to approach it from a very different angle. I've been in the luxury industry and, the entertainment and music side for, many years. I won't say how long. But I think what was very interesting is that CMOs always approached marketing from a very specific perspective. It'd be like, well, I'm a fashion brand, therefore I must be around fashion content. But TikTok almost ripped up that rule book. It said, actually, we're going to know the individual. So I myself am a luxury lover, a luxury buyer. I see no luxury content on my feed. My feed knows me better than any partner I've ever had. It knows that I'm a person that loves tarot card videos that say, new love is coming into your life. It's not coming into my life. It hasn't come in yet. We don't know that yet. It might happen. There's food videos. I'm a gamer at heart. Yeah. And yet traditional marketing has always said that luxury brands, won't target me because they want to stay within that luxury content space. We said this is not about changing your brand. It's about changing the way that you tell that story. So we invented what we called the stay and play communities. And I really believe that in order to cut through in culture today, you have to stay in your community at least 40% of the time. So that means if you're a fashion brand or a beauty brand, of course, be within that space. But to cut through, you need 60% of it and play in the niche communities that are going to be different. So like you said with the Subway example there. And that is ultimately what you said is about you can't buy culture in that way then, and then that's ultimately it. Is like, how do we push the boundaries? How do we stand out? And I always go back to Burberry. I think they are one of the best examples of a brand that has taken TikTok, over the past 5 years and redeveloped their strategy. And they've thought about the niche communities that they can play with. And that's true. Like food was an area that they played into at one stage. And it was a macro community where they said, we're going to get a pasta maker and he's going to create some Burberry pasta. And it took their audience from a fashion audience to a broader audience as well.
I completely agree. I think if you think about brands as people, you want to understand what is this person interested in, and if you just think about some of your, best friends in life, they don't have one interest, they've got many, and the same goes for brands. And so I think we really are, to your point, KK, we're living in a world where it's much more dictated by audiences rather than marketing strategies. And I think it's a really exciting time to be an audience and a really at times terrifying time to be a marketeer. But also, one of my, personal mantras is making a sort of shift from campaigns to conversations, And if you think about how marketing generally works, it exists in this, beautiful looking PDF document that gets greenlit and signed off. And then suddenly 7 months later, the world might actually look like a very different place. The conversation might actually, sound very differently. And I think brands have to be set up to sort of move and observe the conversation. And just kind of, getting back to that notion of unexpectedness, it does have to really make sense. But I think people like to feel surprised, We like to feel surprised, on a personal level, on a passion point level. We like to discover new things. And in terms of what stops the scroll, you need something that has that moment of cultural unexpectedness, but still actually makes sense. It can't be totally ridiculous. Right. Yeah. And the other thing it can't be, I think, is jumping on the bandwagon. We talk in the report about, the Charlie XCX, Brat campaign from last summer, which was an incredible moment for that artist, for her marketing team, etc. But you saw all these brands wanting to kind of jump on the bandwagon, and it was really interesting because it really sort of created a scenario of the ones that were getting it right and getting it wrong. So sometimes it did feel unexpected, but unexpected in the wrong way rather than the right way.
I'd agree.
I really love what you said about thinking of brands as people. And I think so often clients are like, how can we be authentic? How can we be authentic? It's like, what would make you think somebody was authentic? If I came in every week dressing completely differently and I was jumping on every micro trend, you'd be like, oh, I don't trust you, first thing. Do you know what I mean? It would make you think of that person as either untrustworthy, inauthentic. And I think the same applies to brands. And that's a really good barometer of if you're being authentic. If it was a person, would it feel authentic?
Yeah, definitely. And I think also when you're working with properties or when you're working with films or TV or whatever it might be, as you were saying, it's getting the audience, it's understanding what the audience want from that and what they expect to see from that, and then adding value as a brand. So you're not just turning up and kind of it's a badging exercise, or you're just kind of stamping your logo on things. It's understanding how you add value to that conversation or to that moment. And I think that we did something in the US. Our team did a partnership with Captain America, which was kind of a broader Marvel partnership. But they did a load of insight beforehand around the fandom of Marvel. What do they want? How does a brand come in and add something new to that? And what they did was create a whole new storyline. So they took this idea of the background characters in all the Marvel movies, and how they, whenever there was like a big explosion or something going off, they would get dirty. Because like a popcorn cart would like fall over on them, or like they would get like pushed into a river or whatever, like all sorts of things going on. But they created these little storylines of these people then like having to live in this universe and being constantly filthy and having to go home and get cleaned up. And it was just like a little extra bit of the world that's really nice for the fans. You're adding something rather than just kind of banging a packet of Tide on the table in the middle of the seats.
I couldn't agree more, and I love how no one mentioned here Taylor Swift and some of those brands who've jumped onto the congratulations. So we talked about authenticity and long term. Anyway, just moving on, but I just want to make sure I put that in there. But I love the fact that now we're starting to also talk about fandoms, and it's such a big part, specifically as most of our brands are now asking us some big questions around, I want to own cultural moments. Sports and entertainment seems like the place I need to look into. How is your kind of fear of the world kind of evolved, and how brands are doing well are kind of, behaving in a specific way? Clearly fandom is one of the key ingredients there. You've touched upon
Definitely. And I think Gabby would definitely back me up on this, but well, maybe not. But I do think a big part of it is trust. So the brands that I see in the kind of brand entertainment space who are doing it really well are the brands that, again, like P&G, Heineken, Land Rover are really good at it in terms of they trust their partners. They know what they don't know, and they're happy to kind of hand over I was saying about control. They're happy to hand over quite a bit of kind of creative control, and a lot of creative control, to the people who really know how to talk to those audiences. So, it's producers, it's talent, it's creators, it's commissioners at platforms who really understand what kind of entertainment engages people. And the brands are happy to let them do that. They're obviously there as part of the conversation, but they're happy for it to be led from an entertainment first or an audience first perspective. And I think that's really important. Again, it's like that Subway example. Sometimes you have to let go and kind of let people have fun with it. Even if sometimes your brand isn't going to come off looking 100% perfect, because it's not an ad. It's not a controlled environment. You're kind of have to have a bit of fun with it.
Yeah.
100%. I think the word fandom is quite funny, because I think we've been speaking about fandom in marketing for a while now, but I think we're now really in a new era of fandom where brands are starting to, I think, understand in a good way that actually their audiences don't necessarily have to be fans of them. They can be fans of other things, and they have to align their brands to those things. When you work for a brand or with a brand, you are thinking about it, all day, every day. The consumers aren't, and that's okay. They're thinking about the things that get them excited about life. And so I think it's actually about, sometimes being a little bit humble, or sometimes taking a back seat and saying, well, hang on, where are our audiences, hanging out? And let's figure out, to your point, Kathy, not just how we can sort of like do a badging exercise, but contribute to the discussion. And I think, it's amazing how like all you need to do is really speak to, just a few fans that have, a level of, currency within their communities, and they can actually pass on the message, themselves. And, one of the most powerful sort of forms of marketing is having people do the talking for you, and I think and TikTok is a place where that happens. And so if you can get that kind of, that secret equation, right, the hard work in many ways gets done, for you by those fans.
Yeah, definitely. And I love that notion of how we're now in a world where all of these things are just coming together. If I take Formula One as a good example, sports, more and more content with obviously Netflix and now film, fandoms, because more people kind of follow that up, and more brands kind of following up and creating interesting new partnerships, including in the luxury space. So I'd love to get your take from a sports perspective. How are brands kind of evolving from, I want to be into Formula One to I want Lando Norris and his, how they're evolving to something which is a little bit more fandom led than more kind of I just want to be in this sports.
Yeah, well, I think with fandom, like people are, it's in the word, people are like very passionate about it. They are fans of it. And like you said, I think lots of times people are like, there'll be this big cultural moment in sport. And also sport is culture. Like if a third of people in the UK actively follow football, it's culture. There is no bigger moment that trumps like the Euros final or the World Cup, apart from like the royal wedding.
Yeah.
So like you're literally like playing with this massive scale. So it's huge, and also the way people feel about it is very passionate. So people feel very like protective of it. And I think a lot of time brands are like, how can we own this moment? You shouldn't be trying to own it. That is like number one first mistake. Like it's not yours to own, and there will be backlash from the fandoms that feel like it's theirs and feel like it's the team's. So I think a good example of that in sport recently is maybe like the Lionesses winning the Euros. Nike had the campaign rolled out, ready to go. It felt synchronized. They didn't miss the moment, but it was enabling. It was about bringing them home. They weren't trying to eclipse the victory. They were literally just celebrating it. And that's how it should be. And I think when brands want to enter these spaces, like Formula One has obviously like got massive traction at the moment, women's sport. But also it's not always about just trying to find the newest ground untrodden. If you're chasing women's sport because it's a hot thing to chase and lots of brands are getting involved, think about if it's a right fit for your brand, particularly when it's something emerging like women's sport that's very sort of loaded with a lot of political discourse. Make sure it's like the right fit, because you could be doing like some serious damage to your brand's reputation in the pursuit of that.
Yeah, and I really like this notion of it's not just about going to completely new spaces. You can show up in those new spaces or these very famous spaces in a new way through the fandoms and all that kind of stuff.
In a different way.
Exactly. But then going back to your point about being authentic, don't do it because it's the right thing on paper. Do it because it's the right thing for your audience and yourself as a brand, which I think leads me very nicely to a point we're very passionate here at iProspect, which is how do we help brands build better cultural intelligence? Like a big work that I know all of you have done is like lent on data. And usually, the media partners, the agencies or the media platforms are probably the last to be asked those questions when actually we have a trove of amazing data. So how do we get brands to really lean on all that amazing data and create that strong cultural intelligence? So probably start with you, Edward, with all the work you've done on luxury.
Yeah, I think, we're living in a world where there is just like endless data and it can feel, very overwhelming. I think, being a media-driven, business that Dentsu, and iProspect is, I think it's about sometimes, flipping, the way you might look at a platform from a broadcast exercise to an insight exercise, and again, it's about following, where are your audiences, spending time. When it comes to kind of insight, I think, often, it almost feels a bit old-fashioned now to kind of rely on survey data. I'm not poo-pooing surveys at all. We love a survey, but it is ultimately declared behavior. I think what's really interesting is when you start looking at actual, behavioral data versus declared data. So some of the work that we've done, within the luxury practice is, to KK's point, you generally know that a luxury fan is hanging out with luxury content. That's not new and interesting. What is new and interesting is realizing that luxury fans are also really interested in gardening on the weekends.
Exactly.
Or they, are really kind of researching this particular holiday destination that's not one of the obvious luxury holiday destinations, and really kind of relying on platform intelligence to kind of get some of those more unexpected signals, to get some of those more counterintuitive signals, to use that term before. And then also, I think sometimes, it's not just about platform data, but understanding like what might your own data be, as a brand. So I always love, using American Express as an example. Obviously, they have an enormous amount of data about where people are literally spending money, so, and obviously, we often spend money on cultural experiences. So when it comes to kind of designing new cultural programs, if you're a financial services business, you've got a lot of that data at your fingertips. You know how, for example, are spending, their time and money on cultural experiences, and you can design cultural programs, for your customers in that way.
I love it. It's really interesting. And I'd love to see how does that compare with your view from a platform perspective.
Yeah.
Obviously, as agencies, we have lots of tools and we also partner with you guys to have lots of, data we can work together on. But from your perspective, being at the front row of all that kind of trend data coming through, how does that come to life? How does a cultural intelligence piece really work for you guys?
Well, I love when agencies, like, Edward, what you're saying here is that you want to understand the audience and the user. And what TikTok has done is it's an extremely powerful platform now because we understand the individual user in terms of scalability. And I think what's really interesting about this time that we're in now is that we're taking cultural signals and we're building foresight. And so what we're doing is we're developing tools, and we have developed tools where we're able to actually give those insights back. And we do it in a few different ways. So we've got this new product at the moment called Smart Plus, and it automates creative at scale to actually see where your creative is performing through algorithms. And it makes it easier because then we know actually that creative will perform better than this creative, and it will start to serve it. On the second level, we've also got, to your point, how do we actually start to build, who is this audience? What's coming up next? And we want to know what is happening and what is trending. So we have a creative center where we're able to actually go in and see these are the top things that are trending at the moment. And, in the beauty space, in the fashion space, in the luxury space, in the auto space, or just in general in each market, because each market is very different. Who are the audiences engaging with that? And it's available to use for everyone. We can go in as brands and actually be a part of that conversation. And we're actually going a step further now that we can actually analyze data and see, what's emerging so that you can jump on top of the trend before it becomes a trend if you want to be intentional about it. But then on the other side is that, you have to be agile as a brand. And so algorithms and AI is very powerful because what we wanted to do is reduce, the work that goes behind having to create all of that. So we have tools like TikTok Symphony, which is so brilliant that, it will film you right now, Kathy, for instance, an example, and it will take you and it will turn you into an avatar that looks exactly like you, and it will speak 5 different languages. Oh, wow. Yeah. And, we can then create videos from that, or it can take an image from a magazine or just, Instagram or another platform. And you can write a prompt where it will say, make this lipstick, move, or, put it on a woman, for instance, and it will build a video from that. And I think that is the power of where we're starting to move, and where algorithms and AI are starting to shift the nature of how we engage with, brands, or how brands engage with our platform.
That's fascinating. In a world where more and more of the younger generation are very comfortable in virtual worlds, I think more and more feel almost more freedom of expression. So all that kind of space, I think, is really interesting. The intersection between self-expression and culture and technology is really cool. Yeah. Moving on to you, Gabby, I'd love to kind of dig a little bit deeper into, how do we help CMOs who need to sign off a really expensive sports sponsorship, how do you come in, and I've seen firsthand the diligence of your team, how do you use data as effectively to really kind of reassure and show that element of business impact?
Yeah. I'm interested in this. I need to know from a TikTok side what's going to make you sign things off.
It's about diligence, I guess. And it's also about we have such a big data team. Data is such a big part of what we do. I'm a data convert. I didn't used to I was it doesn't really matter. You just kind of see what's going on at the time and decide. But I'm doing great, boss. But actually, it's so important. And what we do is we start with these massive data sets. And they'll be about football fans. They can be about football fans in the UK, and they can go really, really, really deep on who that person is. And particularly when recommending partnerships, it helps you find synergies between two things. So say you want to partner with a brand. Do they have a similar audience? Do they have a similar perspective? And you can find that all through data. And it really is it gives your strategy rigor, essentially. It helps obviously convince stakeholders, and it will also ultimately a more precise insight, a sharper creative brief will lead to better creative, sharper data will hopefully lead to better strategy, which will lead to better creative. And again, you're not just going to have a finger in the air, it's based on something real, and it is based on trying to actually reach and talk to the consumer you're trying to talk to. So yeah, I'm all for the data, and we've got a massive data team.
To play devil's advocate, though, I think we have to be very careful as we go into this new world that we're not being kind of overly subservient, to data. And I think, our industry has always been, I think, at its best where it marries art and science,
Yeah, agree.
in a really kind of, powerful way. And, when we're talking about, cutting through, the algorithm, kind of celebrating creativity, kind of sometimes taking a bit of an experiment, I really am a believer that I think, like, if I was running a marketing budget, having a certain amount set aside, a certain percentage of headspace to try something new that is not only about data, then that's how you might actually break into new frontiers.
Like an experimental fund.
Yes.
I love
Yeah,
that.
definitely. And I think data is super powerful, but we have to be careful that we're not just overly reliant on it.
I agree.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the themes we talked in our piece is the fact that actually we come from a place where it's just intuition. It was a creative-led conversation.
Yes.
So I guess what we're trying to say is we're trying to give it a little bit more professionalism and rigor, and we're here to help. But ultimately, you're absolutely right. It's the balance that really makes a lot of sense. And I think the killer thing for me is how do you connect culture to commerce? And it brings me to you, Kathy, because a lot of the time it feels like there's a very separate conversation about culture over here. And then at the end of the day, somebody else, but I need to sell beer over here.
Yeah.
How do those two kind of connect? And I guess what's your experience in bridging that gap a little bit, and where does data help?
I would say I'm speaking for the entertainment industry now. We get a really bad rap for being very upper funnel, and it's just about brand, and it's just about creativity and fun ideas. And to your point, of course it is. Like, a lot of it is intuition and fun ideas, and you wouldn't end up in a film where you're a drug-addled vision unless that was what you were doing. But there's also a whole other side to what we do in entertainment that is, we can shift the needle from a commercial perspective. So again, we were talking about, convincing your CMO to do a sports sponsorship. On the other side, if you're doing something with entertainment, it's not just about, it will shift brand metrics, but obviously it can, but it's also there's a really good commercial imperative behind it. So, if you're creating, say, an original show, we created an original show with Amazon recently for Birra Moretti, the Heineken brand. If you're doing something like that and you own the IP, you've got massive potential to exploit that. You can license it, you can sell it, you can merchandise it, you can turn it into a game or a product, or, even if you are partnering with an IP, even if you're doing something like the Captain America work, you can use those assets, you can negotiate those rights. So you end up with, on-pack promotions or retail activations, or you can create a licensed product that you can sell. So there's always like this sort of commercial element that you also need to be thinking about. And if you're doing it right, from the beginning, you should be thinking about, how is this affecting my brand, and what brand uplift will I see, but also what sales uplift can I see? And on the Heineken example, there was no direct sales mechanic at the time. It was a couple of years ago through Amazon, but they still saw like a 75% increase in sales of the product through the platform. There is a real measurable impact there that you can see.
And I can imagine with all platforms kind of really dialing up the convergence of content and commerce, that's just going to get louder for brands, right?
Absolutely.
Netflix, TikTok, Amazon, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it needs to be thought of from the beginning as part of the metrics.
Fantastic. Now, I want to touch on another kind of theme. It's kind of echoing some of what we discussed at the start, but one of the big things that brands really struggle is this sense of balance between kind of being on brand and on culture. And one of the themes we talk a lot about in our thought leadership is it's about, empowering brands to be bold, add to the conversation, as you were saying, Edward, earlier. But I would love to get some good examples of when brands get that kind of balance between on brand and in culture right, because we want to be authentic, but we want to grow the brand. How do you do that right? Let's probably start with you, Edward.
Yeah, I think, sort of putting my strategist hat on, I think you still have to come back to your brand, using your brand as an orientation point for what makes sense. Again, like, culture is having a bigger seat at the table. But brand still acts as a really powerful filter for, like, does this make sense, or not. So if I think about, let's just talk about automotive, because, you work on it as well. But, like, I think Mercedes-Benz does a really good job, for example, where they sort of use their brand as a way to kind of almost tap into craftsmanship. There's a lot of craftsmanship, in the automotive space. But they use that as a kind of Trojan horse to suddenly be able to talk about fashion or music, and then suddenly tap into talent that are also in those spaces as well. So I think when you're feeling almost like a little bit lost, or or going off the proverbial, off script, so to speak, your brand and kind of the heritage of your brand and kind of the DNA of your brand can actually be a powerful way to kind of like anchor you back to like whether this makes sense or not. And I think that's important because, sometimes you do just want to maybe do like a bit more of a kind of cultural stunt, kind of be really timely, kind of show that you're moving at the speed of culture. But if you want to double down on a space again and again, for example, if you're an automotive brand that wants to do music not once but over again and again, it does need to make sense.
100%.
And consistency ends up being a really powerful kind of, ROI driver in that case.
No, I agree. I think, I'll take it from a TikTok angle because I think we had to reinvent the way in which content, was created for TikTok. And so when we took a brand, a lot of the time it was, I go back to 5 years ago, no luxury brand wanted to be on the platform. The only two brands that took that risk were Gucci and Burberry at the time. And we had to be very succinct, and I've said it before in this panel, is that, we are not changing your brand, we are changing the way that we tell that story. Yeah. And, you can be an automotive brand, for instance, that is a Bentley, or you can be a Lamborghini, you still have the same space to play on TikTok, but how you tell that story is going to be very different. And I think, we're not saying anything different when we say, be authentic or be intentional. That is very, very, true for any brand that works on the platform and that we try and bring them on board. I always look back to the brands that aren't afraid to fail. And I think the brands that aren't afraid to fail and can be bold and can be risky in that way and say, actually, I will give it a go. They're the ones that will succeed the most. And I truly believe that. I take a brand like Bottega Veneta, who we work very closely with at the moment. They were very traditionally anti-social. They took themselves off all of social. And TikTok was the first platform that they decided to go back on, thanks to you guys as well, and, worked very closely with them. But they didn't want an organic account. And we didn't say, okay, go and play into trend culture. They wanted to be very intentional about the way that they showed up on TikTok. And for them, it was about finding the little moments that stayed true to their brand, but also found the audiences and the communities that engaged with it. Whereas a brand like Defender, for instance, taking an automotive brand, to your point, how they've done it really well, is that every single JLR brand has a distinct lens. So Defender is very different from, Jaguar, for instance. Let's not talk about Jaguar in that way, but and that's okay. But that was an intentional decision for them to reinvent what Jaguar looks like. But for Defender recently, I thought it was brilliant how they actually showed up in the conversation on TikTok, just as Oasis at the time. Oasis is obviously having a big comeback. Yeah. It's been all the talk on TikTok too. Brickcore has become an ongoing trend, and they've sponsored the concerts themselves. And they've just showed up and they've been able to actually be part of that conversation the right way for them. And that, in a way, is okay. We're staying true to who we are as a British brand, playing within music, but we're doing it in the communities that still, are talking about it in a broader sense.
Definitely. I think, sometimes it's easy to forget, like the goal is not about actually having an account with loads of followers, even though that is nice. The goal is conversation, right?
Exactly.
The goal is actually having, people thinking about you, conversing about you, and showing that you're part of their lives.
Exactly.
And there's many ways to kind of go about that. And I love that you brought up Bottega, because it was actually, several years ago when it happened under, I believe, Daniel Lee, Daniel Lee's creative directorship. By actually going off social, it sent a really powerful message. But obviously, fast forward to today, there's now kind of interesting ways to kind of strategize. Well, how do we still kind of, retain a discreet presence, but actually have people talk about ourselves?
Exactly.
So conversation really is, the ultimate outcome there.
And that was actually really unique, because when we went and spoke to their CMO and their teams, we said, actually, the conversation is happening with or without you there. So imagine the power that you have if you can be a part of it. And we actually analyzed 2 sets of data. Like, we looked at a piece of content that Jacob Elordi, who's one of their ambassadors at the time, people were like, oh my God, Jacob Elordi. And if you read the comments, it was all about just how hot Jacob Elordi was. Like, that was it. And actually, the brand sentiment for Bottega wasn't there. However, their number one piece of content was a girl from the Philippines that loved the brand so much that she went and recreated an entire Bottega ad. And she drove more brand sentiment for Bottega than Jacob Elordi did, who they probably paid God knows how much for. But, you know, and it goes to show when it comes to conversation, be part of it. Simple.
Definitely.
I love that because we have a lot of different themes coming up. We have leadership, like be very clear what you stand for so you can be brave and experiment and do things. But also we have this humbleness about there's a conversation happening, like be part of it. Otherwise, we've seen so many great cases recently. Love to get your thoughts, Gabby, on that conversational part as well. Where have you seen brands being able to kind of be, you know, a good balance between strong leadership and humbleness to kind of be part of a conversation?
Okay, so I definitely think from the partnerships, I absolutely love Charlotte Tilbury at F1 Academy.
Oh, yeah.
So it was like just best in class example of how to do a partnership well in sport. So it was like, firstly, F1, it's hot at the moment, everyone's talking about it. It's already got that like cultural currency. Charlotte Tilbury kind of partnered with F1 Academy, which is motorsport training for women. And as part of the partnership, they donated proceeds from 3 products in the range to Karting for Girls. There was a apprenticeship program. So purpose is always like a really important part of, particularly in sports marketing, that we try and strive for with partnerships. So it had purpose. It had cultural currency anyway. And it also was a really nice brand fit. Like when you think about F1, it has this like drama and glitz and glamour. And you think about Charlotte Tilbury, that's always been a cool part of the identity. So it really like just hit like every single facet. And it felt surprising, which is something that we like as well. So it was just really all of those things. I thought that was a really, really great example for all of those reasons.
Yeah, love that example. Really interesting. I'm just going to move us on to the last theme because it's really important. I think we talked a lot about, you know, the instincts, the strategic side of it, the data piece, but ultimately brands who are doing that really well are able to orchestrate that and show longevity, as you were saying, Edward. So I just want to talk about a big pillar that we have in our piece called orchestration. How do we orchestrate culture more regularly? And I think one of the main things I'm realizing as a media person is most of the time brands don't really have the right people around them in the room, right? So how can we help them understand that? I'll start with you, Kathy, around the ways of working to create that orchestration, I guess.
Yeah, well, I mean, actually, it's interesting talking about Land Rover, but they're another one who are really good at like trusting their partners. They really understand. You know, it's not about the control. They'll cede a lot of control to the studio or to the producers or whoever it is that they're working with, and then they get a better product out of that. So I think there's definitely, to do it well, you have to have an understanding of the experts and work with the experts and trust the experts creatively. But then also, I was talking about the sort of commercial imperative before. There's also, I think, you don't just need to kind of have those creative experts around you. You need to have a commercial sort of business sense as well, and have people with you and on your side who can help you to understand that business imperative. So, I mean, the way we do it at Dentsu, we've got, you know, dedicated teams. Obviously, we've got our sports specialists, our entertainment specialists. They have like a real understanding of the business of entertainment. And that, I mean, essentially, we're here to help clients navigate through all of that, negotiate those terms, negotiate the deals that they need to be able to, you know, to get the assets, to get the rights that will enable them to hit all their goals. So whether it's creative or whether it's commercial, I think you need that kind of, we're going back to the Avengers, you need a sort of supercharged team on the creative side and on the commercial side to kind of bring all of that together for you. I think that's where agencies like Dentsu do sit.
Yeah, and that makes sense, right? Because if you have the same people, then you're probably going to come up with the same answers. Where if you really want to lean into culture, you need to think new native, you know, talent and people who can help you navigate those new spaces, which sometimes are very practical questions and all that kind of good stuff. Yeah, I'd love to kind of get your thoughts, Gabby, again on your perspective, because you're in that kind of question all the time where people might not be used to doing big entertainment sports kind of partnerships, and you need to navigate a first time conversation.
Yeah, 100%. I think like what you're saying about like kind of like having these frameworks and maybe like more traditional structures and not completely like throwing them away.
Yeah.
Like I would actually say a brand who does it amazingly in terms of like cultural event marketing, but also seasonally is Skims. Like they are relentless, but they have taken the framework of the seasonal holidays, punctuated by these cultural moments that they plan around, and then use this like rotating roster of the best talent year on year. It is a really genius format. And they're leading it with culture, and they're leading it with like the best talent they possibly can for that moment. So it's kind of like almost like a reinvention of a format by these like new rules of how people respond and what they respond to. So I think that's like a great example, to be honest, of who I would take as like, they really do not rest.
I just want to double down on that thought because I think it's really important for orchestration, right? It's pivoting to that cultural moment planning. So yeah, the fact that you've had a really great example of a brand who does that repeatedly is awesome. Like, what in your view, Edward, are other brands who clearly are able to pivot that and show a little bit more long-term?
I mean, just going back into kind of like the ones that get it right, I think, again, marketing generally comes with like tried and true and sort of just like knee-jerk ways of doing things, right? And so when you think about planning, I think it's about shifting from planning your marketing calendar to moving to where the cultural calendar is, right? So, you know, the great thing about cultural-led marketing is if you are really kind of, you know, backing a certain space, these spaces have their own calendars. You know, there is a music festival calendar around the world. There is a sports calendar around the world. There is a luxury fashion calendar around the world. And so it's actually about getting outside of your vacuum and saying, how can we, you know, plug ourselves into the calendar that, you know, that already exists. I'm annoyed you brought up Skims because it's one of my favorite examples as well. But I think, you know, Skims is really great. You know, another brand from the you know, the lifestyle space that's been kind of on my radar lately is On Running. You know, I think that's a really interesting, you know, space at the moment where, you know, Nike and Adidas have been, you know, were up until a certain point kind of really the dominant players, and now
The billionaire shoe now.
Yeah,
what TikTok's framing
you've
call
got
it.
these other brands like your Hokas and your On Runnings of the world starting to kind of really have a seat at the table, but particularly On Running, you know, just kind of partnering with really great talent. Whether, you know, I don't know if anyone saw it, but you know, they literally had like Elmo, the Sesame Street character, in a campaign, but also they've got Roger Federer, who is actually an equity stakeholder in the business, but also in the campaigns. Yeah. They've also got Zendaya, who's able to speak on behalf of the brand from a more, you know, lifestyle perspective as well. So again, a great lineup of talent, you know, plugging themselves into, you know, the sports calendar. But doing it in a way that is, you know, in some ways kind of like the anti-Nike. You know, if Nike's all about this kind of alpha way of being the best and winning, On Running is very much about kind of, you know, a more personal, kind of like relatable and attainable way of being an active individual. So again, rooted in their brand, you know, DNA and their brand purpose, but being brought to life with exciting talent that catches you by surprise. And across the calendar that already exists, which in this case is, you know, the sports and lifestyle calendar.
That's great. And KK, you mentioned that already, bringing that notion of using tools to create that scale to exactly what Edward was talking about. Do you want to maybe expand a little bit around how you see brands using that repetitive kind of scale element of orchestration of cultural moments? Are they using some of the tools that you mentioned really well? I'd love to know more about that.
Yes and no. I think, you know, brands are still, in a way, you know, they're still digital laggards in some way, I think. And I think you have to have a brand that is still willing, and you need advocates, to your point, Kathy, where you said you need a team of people on all sides of it to be advocates to actually be able to be part of that process. What we do at TikTok is that we are really a part of that process. So we do a lot of comms planning, and we look at it from a creative angle, a strategic angle, all the way down to an orchestration angle. And what we find some of the challenges are, if I can be honest, is that brands sometimes just don't have have the speed at which to be able to do it, because there is so much red tape internally. And so they need to be agile enough to be able to navigate that red tape. And generally it always falls back onto one thing. It's like, you can have the best plan in place, you can have the best cultural moment, and then creative is the one thing that will always limit it. And so I always say, you know, there is a wealth of tools at your disposal. And one of those is actually creators. You know, they don't realize that actually being able to bring on board a creator that can speak your language, that is there already, a part of that community, and can take your brand codes and your lens, is the most powerful thing that you can do to actually drive your narrative forward as well. So that's the only thing that I would add. But I really love what you said about having a cultural narrative, not just cultural narrative rather than a marketing narrative or a calendar, I should say.
Yes.
I think that is so true, because you have to be intentional about what are going to be your key moments. Because we know luxury brands are always going to be around February and September, but what else beyond those two moments, beyond Fashion Week?
Yeah, and picking those moments.
Exactly.
Not just by lurching from one cultural moment to the next.
100%.
Like curating which ones you want to celebrate and build the narrative around.
Yeah, and just to riff off what KK just mentioned as well, like, you know, I absolutely agree. I think when you have a great idea that's, you know, sort of moving as culture moves, you know, by the time you often get that signed off internally, it will feel like yesterday's news, right? But but creators offer an amazing ability to essentially outsource, you know, the effort. And I think one of the other kind of serendipitous things that happens quite nicely is you also get someone interpreting your brand through their lens, you know. And, you know, I think the like audiences and consumers are very comfortable now, you know, intuitively. They understand that when they're seeing something about a brand, it's not always directly from a brand. And it's actually much more surprising when you have a mixture of voices, you know, interpreting a brand, you know, doing it through their own sensibility. You know, every creator has their own inherent, you know, way that they might cut a video or talk about it, like their own sense of humor, etc. And it's okay if they're working with several different brands. And I think, you know, we're sort of, you know, in this era where, you know, I don't want to use the word outsource, but that's kind of really what it is. You can actually really outsource, you know, the labor in some ways, but also kind of the risk.
I agree.
In some ways, and actually get something that is inherently going to be a little bit surprising, because it won't have come from your in-house, you know, creative team.
Yeah, and such a practical way to get around the red tape. Like
Exactly right.
Yeah.
We've tried it all, don't worry on this.
I think that's a fantastic way for us to kind of wrap up. We've just got one last question for you, but I really love that thought around actually that creates an opportunity, that almost that fragmentation, that brands are not ready to move at speed, actually creates the really big opportunity to rethink and be a bit more innovative, and how, you know, whether it's platform or creator, we can definitely support and start to test a bit more. So first off, I'd like to say big thanks to everybody for really, as you can see, everybody's really passionate. We talk a lot about this. And I would definitely recommend that you download our latest thought leadership called Culture Accelerated. A lot of the themes that these guys have beautifully talked about are kind of exposed there, so hopefully some really good pointers. But I just wanted to leave you with your thoughts around culture marketing in 5 years' time. Where do we see this all going? We talked about AI, and we talked about technology. That's not going away for sure. But then we talked about slightly more creative, intuitive-led kind of nuance. Start with you, Kathy. What do you think is going to be the headline in culture marketing in 5 years' time?
I mean, I think AI is not going anywhere, but I think what it does mean is there's going to be a lot of content, and there's going to be a lot of noise. And what we've talked about all the way through this is standing out and kind of breaking through, stopping the scroll, breaking through all of that noise. So the more stuff there is, the more, and I assume a lot of it's going to be rubbish, the harder brands are going to have to work to kind of create that standout and create something that is authentic and that feels human and that creates those connections with their audience. I would say, though, my major takeaway from this conversation is that in 5 years, I am not going to be sitting here because I'm going to have an avatar. It's just going to come and do this for me. So you won't be seeing me again.
Love that.
We'll make sure we bring you in 5 years' time just to disprove that point.
Well, hopefully it will look about 10 years younger than I look now. That's the plan.
We'll get it wearing Gucci, don't worry as well.
Thank you.
Right opportunity. Edward.
Yeah, in 5 years' time, to Kathy's point, I think a lot of what we're talking about will just be table stakes, you know, but one of the consequences of that is there'll just be, a deluge of content, and we'll probably all be, really drowning in it. But it will mean that, what kind of cuts through and stands out, really does, but the bar will be much higher. I mean, I personally just spend a lot of time thinking about just the power of the individual in this day and age. Marketing aside, I think we are, as a kind of, global, society living in the age of the cult of the personality. You see it in politics, you see it in culture, in all of the arenas, that we've been speaking about, not just in marketing, and the power that, individuals have to kind of really actually like tell their own stories, to be disruptors as well. And I think the brands that, will win, I think will really leverage, talent and advocacy, in powerful ways, and have the kind of the courage to actually have other people talk, on behalf of them.
I love that. I've stopped predicting the future working at TikTok. I can tell you what's here today is gone tomorrow, and it's like, oh God, I didn't realize that, Taylor Swift would actually ever get engaged for a start, which we're very happy about. I think, what can I say? I think it's going to be around creativity through algorithms. So I think, we never get rid of the algorithm. The algorithm will dictate, how it's distributed, but creativity is what stops people from, scrolling, and it's there to actually show what people engage with. So I think we'll move away from campaigns to brands building cultural systems, I would say. And I think that's what's going to be very powerful. There'll be the brands that can find, throughout the white space, a cultural narrative that they can continue to grow and actually co-create with people. And I love what you said about the individual. I think we've gotten to a stage now where there is still so much clutter and so much noise. It will be more mindful. I'd like to think that we're in a place where it's more intentional, more mindful, and those systems will actually become an ecosystem as opposed to just a one-off spin.
Yeah, I agree. I think with AI particularly, like the concept, like even with like prompting, a more mindful use of it to create something that feels truly original, creative, rather than just like brain rot. That would be great to see. And also just more generally to think about like the old like luxury paradigm that like excess creates like the desire for the scarcity. I think as there's just more content and more just like slop out there, people will literally have the desire in themselves to want to move intentionally towards more analog forms. I hope so. That's my hope for it anyway. Bring back the mags. I miss them.
On that bombshell, I want to say a big thank you to everybody. And as I said, thank you for being with us. Hopefully that was really interesting for you and your brands to figure out where to play and how to play in culture. And we hope to hear from you very soon. Thank you.
Thank you.